There we go. Hey, hello. I'd like to welcome everyone to this webinar. That is the first of the webinars for the Envirothon season here for 2025. My name is Sue Quincy, and I'm with the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. And I'm helping provide the content, as well as Beth Bernard, who is attending today and presenting for the webinar's topic today of Connecticut's changing forest landscape. She's also coordinating the topic for this year's current issue, which is the forest stewardship in a canopy of change. Beth works with the forestry division in DEEP, the Division of Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, and will be able to give you a lot of detail and information on the topic of forestry and forest as a sustainability issue for climate change adaptation and mitigation as we go through different topics and different ways in which we can advance our understanding of ways that we can look at how to take action on addressing carbon and taking and handling our different towns and municipal problems. So I'm going to turn it over to Beth to start her webinar and see if we can find out any information that we can for addressing the future by looking at our past and changing landscape. So turning over to Beth.
Thank you, Sue. Can you hear me okay? Can everyone hear me?
I think so.
Good. As long as if you can hear me, everyone else probably can, Sue. Yeah, like Sue mentioned, my name is Beth Bernard, and I am the outreach forester for the Division of Forestry at DEEP. Today we're gonna kind of as a first step for preparing for our Envirothon current issue, we're going to talk a bit about the forests in Connecticut, how they are now, and how they were in the past, and what we're envisioning for our forests in the future. So that's my goal for the day. Hopefully pretty simple, not too complex. I'm happy to answer questions as we go along. Please put them in the chat, and Sue will field questions, and I'll stop every once in a while to answer questions as well. So let's have a broad overview of forests in the state. So this illustration shows land cover in the state. And as you can see, there's quite a bit of green on there. Green is the forest. And it looks like our state has quite a bit of forest in it. But you will notice that there's yellow in spots, which is the agriculture, and the blue water. And the developed areas in the center and along the coast of our state are very prevalent as well. We're living in a state that has 1.8 million acres of forested land. And that equals about 55% of our land cover. So this may look, besides the purple, it kind of looks like it's mostly green, but believe it or not, it's just a little bit over half of our land is forest cover. So what happens to our forests on a yearly basis? Do we keep our forests? Are we losing our forests? There, you can check out the graph on the right. What's this showing us is that about 45 million cubic feet of wood through trees is lost every year through tree death. So that could be either tree death through a hurricane, or just the natural death of trees as they age, a forest pest, or it could be in a forest harvest or cut down by a person, that kind of thing. On the other side of that coin, our growth is 133 million cubic feet of wood per year. So more than double the growth than loss of trees. So basically there are more trees added in Connecticut than are removed each year. More trees die from poor health and disease and weather events than are cut by people. So only a small amount of our forest land, only 0.5% of our forest land is harvested every year. And when our forest lands are harvested, it's for a number of reasons. It could be someone who wants firewood. It could be someone who's managing their forest land for forest health. It could be somebody who is, putting up a building or something like that and wants to cut the trees down. There's a lot of different reasons, but it is a very small percentage of our forest land that's harvested annually. And who owns our forests? In Connecticut, the majority of our forested land is owned privately. And so what that means is by individuals, families, the folks that live near you or in any town in Connecticut who have property and they own that property, that forest land is owned by them. Within that privately owned designation is also organizations like land trusts and things like that, as well as corporations. There's some corporations in Connecticut that own a bit of land, mostly just as part of their property. We have very little federal forest land in Connecticut. And then the rest, the almost 30%, is either owned by the state or owned by your town, by towns in Connecticut. So the state owns a bit of land. We have 32 state forests, and I think it's 106 state parks. Sue can tell me if I'm wrong on the park part of it. And there's quite a bit of forest land on those that we manage for the long-term health of the forest and for many different other reasons. So Connecticut's forests today, we have a beautiful state. I have to say, I love our state because we have close proximity to ocean. We have beautiful forests. We have beautiful rivers. And we live in close to all of those features, which is a great place to live. And we're close to some big cities as well. Looking at our forests as they stand now, and as you can think of forests in your community, you may think they maybe have been there forever, right? We don't often think about how long the forest has looked the way it is now and how long it's even been here. And think about for a second how old you think our forests are, right? And how old are the trees in those forests? We can see evidence when we walk around the forests around us and even around our homes sometimes of the past use of the land. So for example, you might see a stone wall that is an older stone wall, not a newer, like perfectly straight one made by a landscaping company, right? Those are clues of pasture land and crop fields in the past. You might see the outline of a charcoal mound, or you might see like a sunken depression in the ground that fills with water. That's indication of past fire control. And also charcoal making. So our landscape in Connecticut has changed, I would say, dramatically in 400 years. And actually more than that, the last 1,000 to 10,000, 11,000 years, our landscape is ever changing. And especially since European settlement, there's been periods of repeating harvesting, loss of forests, land clearing for agricultural reasons, because of storms, because of pests, forest pests. But our forests have been, and they continue to be, remarkably resilient. So we're going to go back in time a bit to the forests of the past. We're going to go back to the pre-settlement time. So focusing a bit on Native Americans and what the forests were like back then, and how they lived with the forest. But just just quick for perspective, you know, if you go back another 10,000 years, you have an ice age, and the forest since the ice age ended changed multiple times. Changes in species, changes in makeup and age and things like that. But the Native Americans, you know, the 16 and early 1700s, they played a key role in influencing the makeup of the forest prior to the arrival of European settlers. So forest acreage in the coastal areas in Connecticut and the river valleys closer to the water, they were often cleared by Native Americans, both so there could be room for living as well as traveling. They also harvested forests, you know, for firewood and you know, all the needs basically, because as you know, there was no stores, so you have to make what you need, including canoes, including tools. All those things were made from trees. So in the 1740s, America, well, our country was started to be settled by English settlers. So Dutch and English settlement started around 1633. And at that time, it was estimated that about 90% of the state was forested at that time. So the Native Americans that lived here, really, they were either on the coast along the riverbanks, but they were forest dwelling people. So when colonists came, they did gradually clear the land to plant crops, to have orchards and hay fields, and develop towns. And there was a lot of trading going on, and they used the forests for many of the same reasons that Native Americans did, you know, for fuel, for heating homes, for firewood, and to provide wood for things like boats, etc. Keeps advancing, I apologize. Okay. So in around the 1830s, settlers continued to clear land, and this was really the peak of deforestation in Connecticut. So most of from 1830 to 1880, it looked a lot like this. These images, by the way, are from the Harvard Forest Archives, the diorama, but it really looked like a lot of cleared land. There was small woodlots like tucked in between property boundaries, and those were kept on purpose for lumber and fuel, and the trees were grown and cut and grown and cut. There was quite a bit of erosion back then, and the flooding, because there was fewer trees, there was also considerable flooding in some areas. So folks during that time used quite a bit of wood. And at that time, only about 25% of Connecticut's land remained forested. So remember, now we have about 55%. It got down to about 25% forest at that time. The needs of the people in regards to trees were heavy. So, I mean, trees were used to burn their homes. And that was one of the main drivers of forest clearing, but also, you know, providing wood for homes and furnitures and wagons and tools. Hickory was used often for tool handles because of its strength, and also used to smoke meats because it gives a nice flavor. Chestnut trees were used for fences and buildings because they're rot resistant. And sassafras, because of its ability to repel insects, the wood is a bit insect repellent. It was used to make beds in chicken coops because we don't want those bugs near our beds, right? So at that time, every household used between 20 and 40 cords of wood a year. So a cord of wood is a stack of firewood that's 4 feet by 4 feet by 8 feet. So if you think of it as like maybe the size of a golf cart, around the size of a golf cart, right? So 20 to 40 piles of that wood a year is what was usually used per household. People also use trees as an important part of their diet. Obviously, maple syrup. Native Americans were the first to make maple syrup, but the European settlers definitely continued that tradition with them. Eating chestnuts roasting on the open fire, that's where that comes from. They have a delicious nutty flavor. Eating blueberries and other berries like raspberries, even berries from the shadbush tree. And that did add variety to the diet, and it also just helps sustain the population through those long winters. So beginning in the mid 1800s and for the next about 100 years, the agricultural lifestyle was essentially abandoned in Connecticut. So a couple events led up to this. One is the Erie Canal opened, and it allowed farm products from the Midwest to be imported into this area at a lower cost. And it made more financial sense to buy some food than grow it at that time. Also, the industrial age and the gold rush, it incentivized landowners to relocate to areas where they could make more money. And also the land was easier to manage in many of those places. So we have a colder climate here. We have a lot of rocks in our soil. And it's not always the easiest place to farm. And so what happened is a lot of the agriculture, the pasture land, the growing food, this died down quite a bit, and it left abandoned pastures and fields. And so in the mid 1800s, we have what is called the old field succession. And a succession is basically describing a process where a forest changes from one type to another. And here, this is a diagram of what that old field succession looked like. And so when a property owner decided to stop farming, or they abandoned their property, whatever, this old field or pasture land was left. And eventually it grew into a forest in these stages. So the weeds and the wildflowers joined in at first, and then young pine trees started. Pine trees grow prolifically in the sun. They will grow quickly in the sun, and many of them will grow. They're an easy grower around here in open, sunny sites. And so pine forests grew 10, 20, 30 years. And eventually what happens with these pine forests is with storms and other disturbances, some patches of sunlight will hit the forest floor, and oak trees, hickory trees that had been developing were popping up. And so that's that process of old field succession. And that is step one to the birth of the forests we have here today. So in the 1900s, it would be, let me back up, it would be nice and easy and easy to understand and nice to explain if that was it. The forest just returned after agriculture was abandoned, and these are our forests. But what actually happened is a number of new threats to the forest started during that same time. So as the fields were growing up and slowly becoming forests over about 100 years, there were a number of factors that reduced the overall amount of forest land as the forest was growing at the same time. So one of them was the chestnut blight. This is a photo of folks in the early 1900s next to a chestnut tree. So chestnut trees were the giants of the forest back then. They were a wonderful source of wood, very important source of wood, food. They supported wildlife. In 1904, this chestnut blight was discovered in New York. And at that time, about 25% of our trees were chestnut. So it took only about 15 years for the blight to spread, this tree disease, basically. And it virtually eliminated the American chestnut, not only in Connecticut, but, New England and the Eastern Seaboard. I say virtually eliminated because there's every once in a while, someone will find a chestnut tree around here and be like, is this an original? But it's exceedingly rare. And if it hasn't already been hit by the blight, it will be soon, because it's around. So there was, at the time when those chestnut trees were dying, there was salvage cutting going on. What salvage cutting is basically cutting a tree that's dying so you can at least use the wood, right? So a lot of chestnut wood was used around them. And the effect that chestnut blight had on our forest is huge, especially because these trees were so huge and such an important part of our ecosystem at the time. Another thing that was playing into this is the forest fires. So we had a busy forest fire season this year, this fall at least. And back in the early 1900s, it was a lot like that, but for a bit different reasons. This year we had a drought, and that really played into it. But the forest fires in the early 1900s were often caused by accidental sparks, especially from the railroad. The railroad was powered by coal, by burning coal, and also burning wood. And so the sparks would fly out and then they would just catch on fire. There wasn't as much monitoring back then. There was a lot of more remote areas where people would not see the fire starting and put them out before they got too big. And also just fire was used a lot more commonly in homes and industries. People also planned their burns. So, it's a lot easier to burn a field to clear the brush if you want to pasture your animals there, than to clear all that by hand. So that was still a very common practice. And I'm sure that that was a practice that was picked up. That knowledge was learned from the Native Americans. Some of the fires at the time, because the resources and the technology to put out fires was not as good or effective. Some fires burned up to 20,000 acres. And as a comparison, the big fire we had this October, the biggest one was about 130 acres in Berlin. And that was the biggest in size we've had in quite a while. Another thing having to do with fire is charcoal production. So starting in the early 1700s and going up into the 1900s, there was a huge demand for charcoal. That was due to the Industrial Revolution and also World War I. And the dependence for charcoal was a driving factor for production at the time, because it was really an important way to make money and sustain your family. So this picture is from Burlington in 1915, and this is a charcoal mound. And basically, this mound would make 900 bushels of charcoal. And then the charcoal was used in many ways to make bricks, to make glass, iron, and brass, whatever things that you would need heat for. Interestingly, it was also used to cure tobacco in the Connecticut River Valley. I know if you live in maybe Glastonbury or Windsor, areas around there, you may notice some of the tobacco industry is still going strong here, and that was used for that at the time. So the men who made the charcoal were called colliers, and here's one in Winstead, a charcoal mound, and they would basically stack wood, about 30 cords of wood in this like pyramid beehive shape. So it's got wood all the way inside with enough air pockets in it to keep it going with oxygen. And they would stack it about 30 feet wide, 14 feet tall, and they would cover it completely in dirt for the insulation, and then they would light it on fire from the inside. And so then these colliers would wait for 10 to 14 days, and the inside of it would just burn and smolder and burn continuously until they had that charcoal that they could sell. So the forest was cut for charcoal. That was the biggest forest-based industry. You know, it was heating homes and charcoal back then. The forest would be cut about every 30 years for this purpose. The reason they cut the forest, I'm sorry, I apologize. My slides keep advancing by themselves. So I apologize for the whiplash if you're getting it. But the reason the forest was cut every 30 years as opposed to every 50 or 70 is that was the point where the trees were big enough to be worth cutting, but not so big that they couldn't be carried by people and oxen, because they didn't have, you know, the machinery, they didn't have the log forwarders we have now, that kind of thing. And they needed something that they could stack and they could make into that beehive shape for that charcoal. So every 30 to 50 years, it was the trees grow, they're cut, they grow, they're cut, and over cycle like that. And the last thing that happened in the early 1900s is the invention of the portable steam powered mill. So this is a sawmill that will basically turn your tree into usable lumber for whatever you need to use it for your table, for your building a home, anything like that. Because these mills were portable, they could travel, and people were able to access the forest, the forest farther away from their homes. So the way this started is people were cutting around their homes that in closer proximity, and then they would cut out and out for access, right? But with this portable mill, you could travel and you could go to a remote part of the forest and cut there. That enabled faster production of timber, more timber produced and sold, and it really changed the way that Connecticut sells and produces timber. It also resulted in stands being cut that were never cut before, or that weren't cut since the old field regeneration. So as a result of all those factors, nearly all of Connecticut had been cut over or burned at least once in the 1920s. And Connecticut's forests, they were in terrible shape. This is what a lot of the forests look like in Connecticut back then. Remember, there was 25% of the land in Connecticut was forest, so there were some patches that were retained for firewood and things like that. So here's a graph so you can understand, you know, the big picture. about this. This is forested acres in Connecticut over time. So on the left here, we have forest land in thousands of acres. And on the right, we have our timeline here. And you'll notice our forest land in red. As the population's increasing, right, we've got the Industrial Revolution here in the mid to late 1800s, and the population goes way up. You'll notice that when settlers came, we have the 1650 and going into 1700s, the amount of forest land really greatly decreased, and it kept decreasing really rapidly until the mid 1800s, when that Industrial Revolution started. And slowly it has been recovering up until about 1970. So if you look at 1970, you're going to see on here, it starts to decrease again, our amount of forest cover. So there's a reason for that, which I'll go into in a second. But that recovery, let me go back for a second, that recovery around the Industrial Revolution, and then in the early, especially starting in the early 1900s, there were a lot of efforts to bring back forest, and there was a lot of reasons that that happened in our state. One big reason is that fossil fuel use started. And so people didn't need as much wood for fuel. The demand for charcoal really decreased. And with very few trees left, the mills stopped working because there wasn't enough wood to cut anymore. So we basically cut ourselves out of selling wood at that point. In 1895, Connecticut Forestry Association was started. And this was an association to help promote public appreciation for the value of forests, to establish state forests. And this is now a nonprofit organization called Connecticut Forest and Park Association, which, you know, it doesn't do exactly what it did back then, but what it was doing back then was basically saying, we need to bring back our forests, right? We've done so much to decimate these forests that it's time for a change. And they were integral in starting the first state forests, which include number one, which was Meshamasik State Forest, which was established in 1903. And that's in Portland, Connecticut, my hometown. And here's our first ranger from that state forest. So that was originally a 70-acre acquisition. It was not forest when it became a state forest. It was just brush land. And it was purchased at $1.75 per acre. Partially, it was chosen because it had quite a bit of American chestnut in it. That changed over time with the blight, unfortunately. It was the first state forest in New England and the second state forest in the whole United States. So it's a pretty special state forest. If you ever have the interest, please check it out. There's also an original sawmill at that state forest, because the state mills their own wood and makes things like picnic tables for our parks. So today we have 32 state forests that are now protected and 110 state parks. Also at that time, the Yale School of Forestry started up, and that's part of Yale University. It was only the second forestry school in the country. And you may have heard of someone named Gifford Pinchot. He was actually from Simsbury, and he provided a good amount of the money to start that school that focused on forestry and really focused on bringing our forests back in Connecticut and the United States. So with all these things happening to boost the return of the forests, there were young forests, a lot of young forests back then in the 1920s. And Connecticut saw a lot of seedlings and sprouts, especially with oaks. Our forests today are dominated by oaks and hickories, and we love oaks. They're super important. They're really valuable for timber, but also they're so valuable for wildlife. We think a lot about the acorns, but also they support hundreds of caterpillar and other insect species. And they are great for just a healthy ecosystem. So today in forestry, we really try to support our oak species and to make sure that they can remain resilient in the face of many changes. So the abuse of the forests in Connecticut in the 1800s and 1900s has created what we see today, which is primarily an oak hickory forest situation with some pines and some other hardwoods, and the loss of the chestnut also due to the blight, creating some sunlight, helping those oaks to flourish, because those little oak acorns need a bit of sun when they're young. They can have some shade when they're older, but when they're young, they need some sun. So from the 30s to the 70s, and I apologize that we can't see the photo on, oh, now you can. Okay. From the 30s to the 70s, most of our forests had 60 to 80-year-old oaks and other hardwoods in them. And that's really, when we go out into the forest today, that's a lot of what we see. Wood products, aren't as needed as they used to be 100 plus years ago. And that gave the forest some time to recover and grow in New England and Connecticut. And then the 80s hit. And that's where, remember when we were looking at that chart and there was that little blip where it was going up, 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 and then it started to go down just a little? That's the 70s and the 80s. So what happened with our land in Connecticut and in the United States around that time is that development, building houses and stores and industry was very affordable. And so the rate of development, especially of homes, neighborhoods, really peaked at that time. It rose a lot. And so we lost quite a bit of forest land to cul-de-sacs, to shopping malls, all kinds of things like that. And what that resulted in is fragmented forests. So small patches of forest that are separated by development. So our landscape today, this is what we look like in Connecticut. If I could put an urban area in here, I would as well, because we're the fourth most urbanized state in the country. But we have some patches of agriculture, patches of forest, and then patches of development. And all of that is basically like a quilt. I'm making that quilt metaphor for Sue because I know she loves quilts. It's a quilt that represents the history of what's happened to this land. All right, let me stop for a second. See, is there any questions?
I have a question.
All right.
This is Lori from Marblewood.
We'll keep going.
So I have a question.
So we have our mosaic, we have our patchwork quilt. And although we have really, since the Industrial Revolution and beyond, we have really rebounded our forests. We have some classic issues in Connecticut that we need to be concerned about with forests, and also some new issues. Sue, is that you waving me down?
Yes. Can you hear me?
I can't hear you.
You can't hear me. Oh. Don't know why. Can you hear me now?
That's weird.
This is very weird.
I
Might
hear
be,
nothing. I'm sorry. Let me look at the chat.
it might,
Oh, was it? Okay. It must be my side, then I can't hear.
is it?
Sorry about that. So there was a question,
Hold
when
on.
did land trusts
Wait,
arise? That's a really good question, Lori. Okay. Can you still hear me? If I take my headset off? Awesome. Okay. So hopefully now I can hear you because my headset decided to stop working. I actually don't know the answer to that, Lori, but I want to find out for you. If you could email me, my email address is at the end of this presentation, but I am guessing it was around the 70s and 80s when development increased, and there was pressure from people to slow down and preserve some of that land. That's my guess. Oh, thanks, Lori. I'll email you that answer later. Awesome. Any other questions? Awesome. So what's going to happen to our forests in the future? You know, these are places that we often take for granted. We drive by on the highway and there's a bunch of trees, right? But these are living, breathing spaces that are resilient and are changing very quickly as we decide to study them. They don't decide, but they change as we are able to study them. So there are a few issues that we have our eyes on right now, and that is fragmentation, climate change, and globalization. So fragmentation, like I mentioned, it started, you know, in the 70s, 80s with a lot of the developments, and you go from a large patch of forest land to lots of smaller patches. This can negatively affect wildlife populations, but it also really can negatively affect the ecological structure of a forest. It can make it more likely for pests and diseases to come in to travel from one patch to the other. And overall, it decreases the resilience of the forest. Climate change is affecting our forests in many ways. And I'll talk about that in a bit, but everything from extreme weather, unexpected weather, to changes in tree species. And, you know, these are happening every year, and we're all learning. We have models to try to figure out how things are going to change, but we're all learning as we go with climate change. And globalization, you know, the shipping of goods back from country to country has introduced pests and invasive species that have really negatively affected our forests. So back to our climate change, we've always had, right, ice storms, drought, wind, flooding, but these are happening more often and in more frequency and higher intensity. And so the changes in the forest from these ice storms, from the droughts, etc., the forest is having less time to rebound between each major event. A good example of, actually a perfect example of this is the drought this fall that really caused a very intense wildfire season. But also, you know, we're getting more like microbursts and things like that will kind of clear a whole area of forest. It's not always a bad thing to have trees come down, but everything is site specific, right? And you have to look at it site by site. But if these events are happening more frequently, the forest is having less ability and time to adapt to them. There's quite a few changes to our ecological systems that are happening, and changes from within our ecological system. So as a result of many things, including a lack of a top predator in the wildlife food chain, as well as the fact that people love to plant gardens, and deer love to eat gardens. The deer populations in our state are high, and herbivory is a huge issue. Herbivory meaning what the deer are eating, and what they're eating are the young trees. So the saplings, the seedlings, and they're preventing those young trees from growing to become older trees. So a lot of our forests look like this. There's older trees, but there's no trees that are just starting or kind of in their teenage years, right? Or in the middle. And that's a bad thing. It's a bad thing for any society, including trees, if you don't have young population there. And so forest managers, our foresters here at DEEP, there's some things that we can do and we are doing to help deal with that problem, including some forest management. So maybe doing more cutting to open up some space so some of those seedlings can come up, and put maybe a slash wall, which is like a 10-foot wall of sticks around them, or pay attention to the species that the deer eat, and promote the species that they don't eat, all sorts of things like that. Diseases and insects that cause harm to our forests are very prevalent. There's more than I can mention in this webinar, and we're going to learn more about that actually in January at the in-person workshop. But one example is the spongy moth, which was formerly called the gypsy moth. But if you live in Eastern Connecticut and the northwest corner as well, and some central areas, you probably experienced the gypsy moth between like in 2016, 2017, up until 2019. We had a drought that year in 2016, 2017. That was considerable. And this insect basically will kill trees within 2 to 3 years, because the larvae, the caterpillars, if you want to call them that, they will eat the leaves, and there'll be nothing else to make sugar for that tree. So eventually, after a couple seasons, the tree dies. We lost thousands and thousands of trees, especially in Eastern Connecticut during those years. That there is actually a fungal agent, a fungus that controls the spongy moth, but that fungus was not as activated like it could be because it was so dry. Fungi need moisture to really thrive. So just another example of how these all interplay: the climate, ecology, people, they all affect each other in a cycle. And lastly, people. We do impact our forests quite a bit through development, like we talked about, through agriculture, cutting fields and things like that. We introduce invasive species. A big part of why we have invasive species, probably the main part, but I suppose animals spread them too. But we do focus a lot on people bringing invasive species to these areas. And we do cut trees for firewood, and other wood uses in Connecticut. There is a forest products industry in Connecticut currently, and it's very important to the state economically, and also just important to the people. I will say that it's actually sometimes good practice to cut, depending on your stand, to help it stay resilient and continue to regenerate. Fire, about 90% of the wildfires that we have in the state are caused by people. So a lot of times we think about lightning strikes and stuff, but the way our weather patterns work here, usually lightning comes with rain. So we're not going to get a fire, right? We're not going to get lightning on a dry day. Looks like there's a question. So Lori, I'm just going to pop to this question because I just noticed it. Lori asks, so we have a domino effect in that disease and insect weaken trees, which then makes them less resilient to an increase in frequency and weather events. I could not have said that better, Lori. Yes, yes. So we talked about human impacts, climate impacts, oops, let's see if I can go back, and ecological impacts to our forests, and they all interplay with each other. And it can be a complex problem to solve at times, right? But with our changing climate, even just if you isolate that climate change, the problems that we had before in our forest are now more complicated and worse with the effects of climate change, right? And vice versa. So thank you, Laura. That was a great way of saying that. All right. So the future of our forest. There's a lot going on, and I don't have near enough time to go into this right now, but we're going to keep learning together as part of the Envirothon team about what we can do to help our forests for the future. But we have to remember that those drivers of change, right? The climate, humans, the ecological system that forests have, those are all dynamic and they're changing quickly. And our forests are changing to those and vice versa. So what we know and love today about our forests is the result of lots of change in the past, lots of change. And we do need to remember how resilient our forests are. There are a number of ways we can support helping our forests become resilient. And if I could nutshell it for you, because we're going to learn more about it later, if we want a healthy, resilient forest, we want healthy trees, we want diverse tree species, like many different tree species. We want diversity in composition. So we want some forests that are very stocked and lots of trees. We want some that are less stocked. We want gaps in the canopy to let some sunlight down. We want lots of diversity. And then we want diversity in ages, right? We need to support young trees in our forests, having those. So hopefully I was able to kind of go over for you the past, present, and possible futures for our forests in Connecticut. And, you know, just a reminder, this is just an overview to give you some really perspective to prepare yourself for your Envirothon work. I would love to answer any questions you might have if you have them now.
Hey, if anyone has any questions, I'd like you to go ahead and open up your mics and go ahead and ask. We have a couple minutes left in our session here.
Beth, I have a question. It's Lori again from Marblewood. I'm sorry, I have lots of questions, but anyway.
That's fine.
At some point, will we be talking, and I'm sorry, my mother's in the background with the TV on, we'll be talking about how wildlife may shift in regards to declining oak species, especially or not?
I think that we're likely to touch on that, but we're coming up like a forum to represent different stakeholders, and one is folks who are interested in preserving wildlife through forest management. So we're definitely going to touch on that, and it'll be kind of woven into everything. Yeah, but it's not the main part of the current issue.
Okay, so it makes sense. And so you'll probably talk more about the management end and the different management strategies and how this could impact. Right.
Exactly.
Okay, got it.
Exactly. So this could be great for this type of bird, or, you know, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Do want to remind you that January 18th is the workshop that will be taking place. That is the combined workshop of aquatics and the current issue on our discussion preparing for the presentation. So it'll have aspects of communication as well as the forest and stewardship, canopy of change topics covered as well. So it'll be covering a lot for your students in preparing them for the competition and research the topic as well as on speaking points. So you may want to look into how to get your team or portions of your team there in preparation for the competition in May. And that is the January 18th is the date for the in-person training. This
Awesome.
webinar, yeah, I'm sorry. This
Oh,
webinar,
no, I was just gonna say thank you, everybody, for listening, and don't hesitate to reach out to me or Sue if you have questions. We'd be happy
sure.
to answer.
It will be transcribed and will be posted so that the recording will be able to be accessed for you and your team to refer back to for any points or interest areas for in the coming weeks. So it'll be always available to you. If you have any questions, reach out to us, either myself or Beth or anyone on the Envirothon committee.
Oh, can I
Thanks.
ask a question?
Sure, go right ahead.
I also see a lot of squirrels in the Connecticut, and I want to know, do they have the same effect as deer did to the forest?
That's a great question. So deer will eat like the young, their heads are higher, right? So they can eat the buds off of young trees. Squirrels will eat a lot of the nuts and stuff from oak trees, so they don't have the same extent of defoliation of young trees as the deer do. Really, you know, it's more minimal with squirrels. That's a great question.
Okay, thank you.
And a point in the favor of the squirrel, as a personal squirrel fan, squirrels will actually help transplant trees because
Yes.
they don't always collect all the nuts that they bury. So they
Yes.
will actually spread them out and help forests regenerate.
Yeah. And on a slightly related note, did anyone notice how many acorns we had this fall? Like
Yeah.
how acorn heavy our state was? I'm glad I didn't trip on any of them. But that is an adaptation that oak trees have, and many species of trees actually. And it's called a mast year. So there's a certain cycle where there's some years that they produce more seeds or in nuts in a burst, and that's to help leave extra acorns, since the population of, for example, squirrels and other animals that eat them will kind of in a way match the number of acorns. They'll do a little burst, so there's extra for the forest in the future. But it's always an adventure to clean them up off the driveway.
Yeah, definitely. Well, everybody have a very nice week coming ahead, and happy holiday as we enter into that season as well. And hopefully we'll see you all in January.
Thanks, Sue.
Okay. Bye-bye, all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.